July 1934. John Dillinger was one of the most wanted men in America. Newspapers had turned his name into a symbol of danger. Police departments across the country were looking for him. The FBI was closing in. And after a series of bank robberies and violent escapes, Dillinger had become one of the most famous criminals of the Great Depression era. But before his final days in Chicago, Dillinger had already pulled off one escape that sounded almost impossible. It happened at the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. And the weapon he used was not a real gun. It was made from wood. At the time, Dillinger was being held in the jail while awaiting trial for the murder of an East Chicago police officer during a 1933 robbery. The jail was considered secure, and Dillinger was under heavy guard. But Dillinger had something many prisoners did not have. He had experience. He had already escaped from prison before. And he knew that sometimes, escaping was not about having the strongest weapon. It was about making people believe you had one. According to historical accounts, Dillinger fashioned a wooden object into the rough shape of a handgun. The exact details of how he made it and how long it took remain less certain, but the famous story is clear. He used the fake weapon to make jail employees believe he was armed. Then came the moment that changed everything. Dillinger reportedly confronted guards with the wooden gun and threatened them. To the people looking at it, it appeared to be a real firearm. And that was enough. He moved through the jail, taking control of the situation and freeing himself from custody. But there was an even bigger problem. Dillinger was not alone. Historical accounts say that another prisoner, Herbert Youngblood, escaped with him. The two men left the jail and made their way out of Crown Point. What happened next became one of the most embarrassing moments in the history of the jail. Dillinger had escaped using a weapon that could not fire a single bullet. A piece of wood had been enough to defeat the security of a jail holding one of America's most dangerous criminals. But the story was far from over. Because Dillinger still needed a way out of Indiana. And according to the historical record, what happened after the escape would make the story even more remarkable. The wooden gun had opened the door. Now Dillinger needed a real vehicle. And somewhere outside the jail was a car that would become part of one of the most famous prison escapes of the 1930s. The chase had begun. And the authorities were already behind. The wooden gun had done its job. John Dillinger was out of the Lake County Jail. But escaping the building was only the beginning. Outside those walls, Dillinger was a wanted man in a country where police were already searching for him. Every mile away from Crown Point increased the chance that he could disappear. But there was another problem. He needed transportation. Historical accounts state that Dillinger took Sheriff Lillian Holley's automobile during the escape. Holley had become sheriff after her husband, Sheriff Robert Holley, was killed during an earlier confrontation involving Dillinger's gang. The irony was difficult to miss. The very jail that had been holding Dillinger was now missing its most notorious prisoner. And the sheriff's car was gone too. Dillinger and Herbert Youngblood drove away from Crown Point. But their escape did not go exactly as planned. The automobile they had taken was not simply a getaway car. It was a police vehicle, and taking it across state lines would later become an important part of the federal investigation. Dillinger eventually separated from Youngblood. From that point forward, the escape became part of the larger story of Dillinger's criminal career. He was no longer simply a prisoner who had escaped. He was now a fugitive again. And he had something that made him even more dangerous: freedom. For law enforcement, the situation was humiliating. A prisoner awaiting trial had escaped from a heavily guarded jail with what was supposedly nothing more than a wooden replica of a gun. The story quickly attracted enormous attention. Dillinger's reputation grew. To the public, he became a larger-than-life criminal figure. To law enforcement, he represented a growing problem. But there was an important detail behind the headlines. Dillinger did not escape because the wooden gun was powerful. It was powerful because the people around him believed it was real. That distinction would become part of his legend. The escape also revealed something about Dillinger's approach. He understood that fear could sometimes be more useful than force. A real gun could kill. A fake gun could still make people obey. And in that moment, Dillinger had turned uncertainty into control. But the authorities were not going to simply forget what happened. The escape triggered an investigation. The FBI became increasingly interested in Dillinger's movements, especially because the stolen sheriff's automobile had crossed state lines. Federal agents began building a case around the fugitive. Dillinger, meanwhile, returned to the underground world he knew so well. He moved between locations, relied on criminal associates, and continued trying to stay ahead of law enforcement. But the escape had changed the situation. The man who had walked out of the jail carrying a wooden gun was now one of the most heavily hunted criminals in America. And the irony was that his most famous escape weapon was not even capable of firing a shot. The wooden gun had become a symbol. But Dillinger's freedom would not last forever. As the summer of 1934 continued, the net around him began to tighten. The FBI was getting closer. And eventually, Dillinger would make one decision that would bring him to the place where his story would finally end. That final chapter had nothing to do with a wooden gun. It began with a woman, a movie theater, and a trap that Dillinger never saw coming. The wooden gun had helped John Dillinger escape, but it could not make him disappear. After leaving Crown Point, Dillinger became one of America's most hunted criminals. The story of his escape spread quickly, adding even more attention to a man who was already famous for robbing banks and escaping from custody. For Dillinger, staying free meant constantly moving. He needed places to hide, people he could trust, and ways to avoid police. But the country was changing. Federal law enforcement was becoming more organized, and the FBI was taking a much greater role in hunting dangerous fugitives. Dillinger's name was now firmly on their radar. The FBI began following leads connected to his movements and associates. Meanwhile, Dillinger continued traveling with members of his criminal circle. He was not living a normal life. Every hotel, road, restaurant, and public place carried a risk. One mistake could expose him. And eventually one mistake did. In July 1934, Dillinger traveled to Chicago. There he became connected with a woman named Polly Hamilton and another woman known as Anna Sage. Sage was a Romanian-born brothel owner who had connections in Chicago's criminal world. She would later become one of the most important figures in the final days of Dillinger's life. Federal agents had been searching for information that could lead them to Dillinger. Then they received a breakthrough. Authorities learned that Dillinger was spending time with Sage. The FBI began watching her. According to historical accounts, Sage agreed to cooperate with investigators after learning that she faced possible immigration problems. She gave authorities information about Dillinger's plans. Then came the decision that would seal his fate. On July 22, 1934, Dillinger planned to go to the movies with Sage and Hamilton. The theater was the Biograph Theater in Chicago. The FBI learned where Dillinger would be. Agents began preparing for the operation. They did not know exactly what Dillinger would do when he saw them. They knew he had escaped before. They knew he was considered dangerous. And they knew he might be carrying a real weapon this time. Sage wore an orange-colored dress that night, hoping agents would be able to identify the group as they left the theater. Dillinger, unaware that law enforcement was waiting for him, entered the Biograph. He watched the movie. For a short time, everything appeared normal. Then the movie ended. Dillinger walked outside. The agents were waiting. The manhunt that had begun long before Crown Point was about to reach its final moment. Dillinger had escaped from prison. He had survived years of danger. He had fooled guards with a wooden gun. But now he was walking directly toward armed federal agents. There was no jail door to trick this time. No wooden weapon to create confusion. No escape route prepared in advance. Just a dark Chicago street and a team of agents waiting for the right moment. Dillinger stepped outside the theater. And within seconds, one of America's most famous criminals would be dead. But even the final moments would become the subject of controversy. Because what happened outside the Biograph Theater was not as simple as the headlines made it seem. The gunfire was real. The death was real. But questions about exactly what happened in those final seconds would remain for decades. And the man who once escaped with a wooden gun was about to become a legend that America would never forget. Chicago. July 22, 1934. John Dillinger walked out of the Biograph Theater after watching a movie with Polly Hamilton and Anna Sage. He did not know that federal agents were watching. The FBI had been tracking his movements, and agents were positioned outside the theater. Their target was one of America's most wanted criminals. Dillinger had escaped from custody before. He had survived armed confrontations. And he had escaped the Lake County Jail using a weapon made from wood. But this time there would be no escape. As Dillinger walked away from the theater, the agents moved in. According to the historical record, Dillinger noticed something was wrong and began running. The agents followed. Dillinger reached for a weapon. The agents opened fire. In the darkness outside the theater, several shots were fired. Dillinger was struck multiple times. He collapsed on the sidewalk. John Dillinger was dead. He was only 31 years old. For the FBI, the manhunt was over. For the public, however, the story was just beginning. News of Dillinger's death spread rapidly. Crowds gathered near the Biograph Theater. People wanted to see the place where the famous fugitive had taken his final steps. The man who had become a national obsession was suddenly gone. But questions remained. The official account was that FBI agents confronted Dillinger and shot him after he reached for a weapon. Yet over the years, the exact details of the shooting became the subject of debate. Some accounts questioned the number of shots fired and the precise circumstances surrounding Dillinger's final moments. There were also later claims from people who suggested that the government had made mistakes in identifying or killing Dillinger. However, these claims have never overturned the established historical account that John Dillinger was killed by FBI agents outside the Biograph Theater on July 22, 1934. His death brought an end to one of the most famous manhunts of the Depression era. But it also created something else. A legend. Dillinger's life had been filled with dramatic events. Bank robberies, shootouts, prison escapes, stolen cars, safe houses, and finally, a deadly confrontation in Chicago. But perhaps the strangest part of his story was still the simplest. A piece of wood had helped him escape from jail. The object looked enough like a handgun to frighten people into obeying him. It did not fire bullets. It did not contain ammunition. It could not actually hurt anyone by shooting them. Yet it helped create one of the most famous prison escapes of the era. That escape became part of the reason Dillinger's name survived long after his death. But there was another side to the story. Dillinger was not a fictional outlaw. The crimes connected to him involved real victims, real violence, and real fear. The romantic image of the Depression-era outlaw often hides that reality. Behind the newspaper headlines was a criminal whose actions caused serious harm. And behind the legend was a man whose luck eventually ran out. The wooden gun could fool guards. It could create fear. It could open a jail door. But it could not protect Dillinger forever. The final chapter would bring together the escape, the manhunt, the FBI investigation, and the legend that remained after his death. Because the wooden gun was only one part of the story. The real question is why this strange prison escape became one of the most remembered moments in American crime history. John Dillinger's story ended on a Chicago sidewalk in July 1934. But the story of the wooden gun had already become part of American crime history. Months earlier, Dillinger had been locked inside the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. He was supposed to remain there until his case was decided. Instead, he found a way out. The weapon that helped him escape was not a real firearm. It was a wooden object shaped to look like a handgun. That simple fact is what made the escape so remarkable. Dillinger did not need to fire a bullet. He only needed the people around him to believe that he could. The escape demonstrated something that would appear again and again in stories about criminals and prisons. Sometimes deception can be as powerful as physical force. Dillinger turned a piece of wood into a symbol of danger. He used it to intimidate guards, escape custody, and begin another period as a fugitive. But the escape also came with serious consequences. The stolen sheriff's automobile became part of the federal case against him because it was taken across state lines. The FBI became increasingly focused on Dillinger. The manhunt grew. And eventually, agents tracked him to Chicago. On July 22, 1934, Dillinger walked out of the Biograph Theater. Waiting outside were federal agents. Within moments, the fugitive was shot and killed. He was 31 years old. His death brought an end to his criminal career, but not to his legend. For decades, people have remembered Dillinger as one of the most famous criminals of the Depression era. His name became connected with daring robberies, prison escapes, police manhunts, and the dramatic final confrontation outside the Biograph. But the wooden gun remains one of the strangest details of all. It was not powerful because it was capable of firing. It was powerful because people believed it was real. That is what makes the story so memorable. A prisoner inside a heavily guarded jail somehow convinced people that he had a deadly weapon. And with that deception he escaped. Yet it is important to remember that the legend should not erase the reality. Dillinger was responsible for serious crimes, and his criminal career involved violence, fear, and victims. The dramatic nature of his escapes should not turn those events into entertainment without recognizing the damage caused by the people involved. In the end, Dillinger could escape one jail. He could escape one manhunt. He could disappear from authorities for a time. But he could not escape the growing reach of federal law enforcement. The wooden gun gave him freedom for a while. It did not give him a future. And that is the final lesson of John Dillinger's escape. The most dangerous-looking weapon in the room does not always have to be real. Sometimes all it takes is fear, confusion, and one convincing deception. In 1934, a piece of wood helped a wanted criminal walk out of an Indiana jail. Years later, the escape remains one of the most famous prison stories in American history. Not because the gun could fire, but because it couldn't. And that is why John Dillinger's wooden gun became a legend.